Hey everyone, Adam Beck here from HardcoreGamer.com, and today we are talking about Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker. We were invited to attend the media event to try out the various new additions and changes we can expect from the upcoming expansion. This includes new areas, a dungeon, job changes, and of course the new jobs Reaper and Sage. While Endwalker can't come fast enough, this is only a snippet of what we can expect when the expansion hits next month. While we weren't able to experience any of the story, we were able to explore a portion of the world. This includes the exotic Thavnair, the ruined Garlemald, and the majestic city of Old Charlian. We even got to visit Alphinaud and Alizé's estate. When we saw Thavnair at the fan festival earlier this year, I wasn't much of a fan of the color scheme. I love the Indian-inspired architecture, but the multicolored environments, not so much. Thankfully, this didn't bother me as much as I thought it would, and even in specific lighting, it looked rather serene. The lavender mountaintops were no different from the forestry of Lakeland, just a little more rounded. Garlemald, on the other hand, is as lifeless as we expected it to be. The outskirts of the decimated city is filled with monsters and what looks like craters from bombs. There's a subway, what looks like an oil rig, and a small portion of the city that has been segmented from the rest. Finally, there's Old Charlian, which is an absolutely beautiful locale. When the sun glistens on this port, it shines with radiance, but then there are snowy days where you just want to sit down and take it all in. While we were only able to experience 1/3 of the world of Endwalker, it had us so excited to see what Square Enix has yet to reveal. As for the dungeon, we got to try out the Tower of Zot. Unlike what we got to play during the Shadowbringers media tour, Dawn Meg, this isn't some vibrant fantasy setting. This properly sets the tone for Endwalker, taking place in this disturbing, organic tower filled with nothing but death and destruction. All through the dungeon we faced off against the Magus sisters, with the final encounter pinning us up against all three. Obviously this is content consumable for the masses, so it's not particularly difficult, but at the very least the first boss requires you to read the enemy's attacks and act on its delayed actions. The rest of the dungeon is relatively straightforward, with linear pathways filled with mobs as you go from boss to boss. There's even a throwback to a Final Fantasy XI enemy, Umbril, but most of the enemies are repurposed or touched up upon. The Tower of Zot will most likely be Endwalker's first dungeon, and it was a little underwhelming. Compared to Dawn Meg, there's nothing flashy here. It's just your run-of-the-mill dungeon with some solid bosses. Granted, it could change, but from what we experienced, it was just okay. Now let's get into what people really want to know about, the changes to the jobs. Every expansion there are various alterations and reworks, and while it's not on the same level as Shadowbringers, Endwalker does come with a good chunk of innovation. I'm going to try and avoid bringing up potencies because they are still a work in development, although I might mention some of the larger discrepancies. With that said, let's get right into it. We may as well start off with the poster boy of Endwalker, Paladin. Of all the tanks, I think I'm most excited for Paladin, to the point I might give up my axe. The biggest addition is the Confiteor combo, which gives 3 additional follow-up attacks. This ties into Rex's slight rework, simply giving players 5 stacks to be used within 30 seconds to instacast Holy Spirit and Holy Circle. This is one of the most satisfying combos in the entire game, to the point I'm immensely jealous that I'm going caster next tier. Paladin has also received numerous adjustments to its mitigation to be more manageable as a main tank and is now the champion of self-healing. For example, Sheltron has been upgraded to Holy Sheltron, which adds 15% more damage production and a 12-second heal over time effect. This isn't to mention Intervention, which has gotten a very similar treatment. Divine Veil mostly stays the same, but now restores the target's HP for 400 potency at level 88, and Holy Circle and Spirit will also heal on every cast. Along with this, Spirits Within is no longer tied to your health, and is changed to a new attack at level 86 that does splash damage. That's generally all Paladin has gotten, but it's enough for us to get excited. The Confiteor combo is what players will come for, whereas the additions to its mitigation will be what they will stay for. Warrior has received some sizable reworks that have us a little concerned for the job. The biggest is no doubt the rework of Inner Release, simply giving players 3 stacks and no longer affecting OGCDs. On the positive side, this is now a 60-second cooldown, so it will align with all the other buffs, but it's technically 1 less attack every 2 minutes prior to level 90. It also takes some of the fun out of figuring out when to use and line up OGCDs such as Upheaval and the Gap Closer, both of which no longer require Gauge to be used. At the very least, there's the new Primal Rend attack, which is a flashy aerial spin that does even more damage than Inner Chaos. Surprisingly, Warrior has received some fantastic quality of life improvements to its mitigation. Shake It Off now restores HP to all affected by 300 potency, Equilibrium has a heal over time effect, Raw Intuition's damage reduction has been reduced to 10%, but now has the same effect as Nascent Glint, and Holmgang is 10 seconds long, which is very good for tighter scenarios such as in the Epic of Alexander. Unfortunately, Nascent Flash has been completely nerfed. Where it would generate a portion of HP back per strike, that pool is now capped at 400 potency. At least Bloodwetting, the new Raw Intuition, has similar effects as Holy Sheltron, but instead of a healing over time effect, Warrior is granted a barrier. I'm kind of disappointed with the changes to Warrior. If you thought it was easy before, it looks like it'll only get easier with any complexity removed from the class. I just don't know what to say. The new mitigation components work well, but everything else just feels stripped down. At the very least, you can apply your damage buff through your AoE combo, so I guess that's something, but... Just when I thought I couldn't get any worse, let's go straight into Dark Knight. Dark Knight is one of those jobs I had hoped would get a lot of attention, but unfortunately it's one of the least changed. Similar to Warrior, Delirium now grants you 3 stacks. Instead of a follow-up, the level 90 attack is a 2-stack heavy hitter. It's less flashy, but more practical than Primal Rend. Salted Earth will now be placed at your feet, and it will explode with immense damage to anyone that's inside. Also, Unmend will now refresh your plunge by 5 seconds, because apparently that's something we wanted. Finally, Dark Knight picks up a 10% mitigation that can be placed on yourself or another party member. It's good, but when Paladin and Warrior are getting all these healing effects to their mitigations, Dark Knight feels a little left out. It feels like Dark Knight got a raw deal in Endwalker. Some of its new additions are pleasant, but there should have been more done to its existing skills outside of an Unmend enhancement, something rarely anyone will actually utilize. Finally, we have Gunbreaker. This high-paced, high-damage, and immensely fun job to play, shockingly, became a fan favorite in Shadowbringers. One of my biggest complaints, though, has been that there was just too many buttons. Fortunately, some of this has been alleviated. The Gnashing Fang combo has been consolidated into a single button, rotating between the 3 hits when they become available. I couldn't have asked for a better quality of life change. There's also a Burst Strike continuation, but more importantly, there's a new skill called Double Down, which deals a staggering 1200 potency, more than any other attack, and with a 20% fall off rate, it seems overpowered. With that said, it does require 2 cartridges to pull off, so there is a little bit of a cost. It's not free. Similar to Paladin and Warrior, Heart of Stone's new enhanced skill at level 82 comes with added mitigation. This includes stronger damage reduction and essentially a mini XCOG on the targeted player. Finally, Gunbreaker's Super Bolide also lasts 2 seconds longer, which, similar to Warrior, is good in very specific scenarios. Gunbreaker just feels a lot cleaner with how Gnashing Fang works, and the new Double Down attack fits perfectly within its arsenal, although its potency and fall-off rate seem a little strong. Still, Gunbreaker's adjustments don't greatly affect how it'll play as a job. Instead, it's just going to be a slightly smoother experience. As for healers, we may as well start off with one of the 2 new jobs. The one that erased Astrologian's Nocturnal Sect, Sage is one of the most compelling healers I've ever played. As a DPS player who rarely heals in endgame content, I was far more excited for Reaper, but after playing Sage, I'm far more interested in the Gundam-inspired job. A lot of Sage resembles that of Scholar and a bit of White Mage. Adderskull is what bridges the 2 together. This is essentially Aether Flow, but instead of pressing a button to refresh it once a minute, it is regenerated whilst in battle, similar to White Mage's Lilies. Again, similar to Aether Flow, these can be spent on various instant healing abilities. These include party-wide shields, AoE heals, and single-target heals. What makes Sage unique is its modifiers, cutting down on the number of actions you'll actually have on your bar. By pressing an ability, you'll be able to modify the Cure, Medica, and Glare equivalents, turning them into Adlo, Succor, and Dia respectively. I absolutely love this feature, although you'll have to be quick on your feet as it's something to weave in, which thankfully is aided with the new 1.5 second global cooldown for healers. There's also equivalents to Neutral Sect, Emergency Tactics, Align Based Size, Celestial Opposition, and various others. That's not to say it doesn't have its unique abilities, such as Icarus, which is a gap closer that'll send you flying to an enemy or comrade within 25 yalms. There's 2 charges of a very powerful splash attack, an AoE that eats an outer scale, and 2 unique single target shields that can essentially replace itself upwards of 5 times. While there are overlapping concepts, taking from the best of all worlds, it certainly has its own identity. There's even a stronger emphasis on damage, with a skill called Cardian being assigned Dancer style to someone, and every time you do damage, that person gets healed. I was completely taken aback by Sage. I only sometimes dabble in White Mage and Astrologian, but Sage has me completely enthralled. While I'll probably never actually make the leap from DPS and tank to healer, it felt like a far more manageable Scholar. As for White Mage and Scholar, both have very similar additions with little changes. White Mage's biggest alteration is Thin Air, now only affecting one spell instead of everything cast in a specific amount of time. To compensate, which isn't much of one, there are 2 charges and it's on a 60-second cooldown. Outside of that though, there are some minor healing buffs and some new skills. Both receive brand new single target and multi-target attacks, White Mage getting a brand new shield ability, while Scholar raises everyone's health temporarily. Then we have the level 90 skill, which no doubt will be the talk of the town. White Mage has the most practical, being something you place on the ground, and every time you take damage, it will pulse the equivalent of a Medica to everyone in range. This can be very handy in Savage and Ultimate fights when there is consistent damage going out. Scholar, on the other hand, gets a raid-wide sprint. Okay, it's a little more than that, giving the party a 10% damage reduction, but this just feels really bizarre. On one hand, it's literally a 20-second sprint that melee can utilize for greed, but on the other hand, this is only really useful in very obscure situations. Outside of that, both healers pick up the new 1.5 second global cooldown for their damage abilities, which should make it far easier to weave in actions. Regardless, while these 2 jobs don't pick up too much outside of these additions, they will continue to be fantastic choices for any piece of content. Look to the stars, my Astrologian brothers and sisters, as we're getting a galactic rework. This is something we've known for quite some time, but now we have a better understanding of what it entails. Most notably, outside of essentially removing Nocturnal Sect, a lot of changes resemble that of how it played during Stormblood. For example, Minor Arcana are no longer buffed cards, but now they will either deal damage or heal. Astrodyne is the brand new skill that cards go into, and depending how many seals you put into it, it will do different things. 1 sign grants MP restoration, 2 will reduce cast times and recast times, and for 3, damage and healing potencies are increased by 5%. This makes Astrologian far more strategic, figuring out when to use these or hold on to them during burst, but it also means it's even more RNG based, considering there's no longer stacked redraws or even sleeve draw. With all the cards going into this system, what happened to Divination? Well, it's no longer any different than something like Chain Strategian, where it's just a 6% damage buff you hit every 2 minutes. Outside of this, there's the same single target and multi-target upgrades all healers get, alongside a single target damage reduction spell. The level 90 skill Macrocosmos is the Star Shower effect you may have seen in the live letter, striking all enemies while restoring a certain amount of damage the party receives while active. This fits perfectly with Astrologian's time-delayed skills such as Earthly Star and Horoscope. The change to a more pure healer is significant, but the job still plays very similar to how it did before. You'll still be drawing cards and buffing your team, but it feels like there's even more of an RNG emphasis due to Minor Arcana and a lack of guaranteed seals, even though the opener will be a little less stressful. I do love how Square is bringing back older skills from Stormblood, such as speeding up your GCD, but I do wish you could apply it to others instead of just yourself. Regardless, it should be interesting to see how the community reacts to such significant alterations to such a beloved job. Moving on to casters, there's a lot to talk about here, but I guess we should start off with the big one, Summoner. The biggest rework in Endwalker comes in the form of Summoner, something I don't think anyone doubted for a second. Summoner has always been an iterative job that was kind of stuck between philosophies, and finally there's a massive rework to fix that. Whether or not it'll be good or bad is still up for debate. It still retains certain elements such as Aetherflow and Fester, but now are just OGCDs to press whenever they're up. Same with Ruin 4, which can be procced once a minute, and Try Disaster being a simple AoE. Not to mention, dots have been completely removed. The core rotation has changed significantly, with you being able to summon Bahamut immediately. After this, you'll be granted 3 different phases to choose from: Garuda, Titan, and Ifrit, each with their own single target, AoE, and unique abilities. Garuda has a persistent ground target AoE similar to Salted Earth, Titan has Weave similar to Continuation, and then there's Ifrit. Ifrit is the most unique as you're only granted 2 attacks instead of 4, which are not instacast mind you, and its special skill is a Gap Closer and Finisher. After this, you go into the standard Phoenix phase, unlock these 3 primals once more, and then you repeat the entire process. This is an incredibly flashy and engaging change that's just as busy as Summoner has ever been, and that might be my biggest concern. The only other noteworthy change would be Devotion, which is now called Searing Light. This has been reduced to a 3% damage increase for the party, but now lasts a staggering 30 seconds. It still was refreshing to play as someone who never really got into the job to begin with, but it'll end up being an acquired taste. Still, it should be fun to optimize, considering you have to choose the order of your primals, and it truly makes you feel like a summoner at the end of the day. Unfortunately, or fortunately depending how you look at it, Black Mage hasn't changed much. The biggest alteration is Enochian now being a passive trait, meaning you won't have to weave it into an opener. You'll still be punished for dropping it, but it's far more forgiving. The emphasis is ensuring it doesn't fall off, as the new level 90 skill refreshes your Astral Fire, on top of dealing a good amount of damage. It should, in theory, replace the use of Fire 1 in your rotation. There are also some smaller adjustments that tie into the new Fire 2 and Blizzard 2 replacements, and a skill that will give you a single charge of Polyglot, but otherwise that's it. With more of an emphasis on quality of life improvements, Black Mage is one of the least altered jobs in Endwalker. Now, as someone who is going to be playing Red Mage next tier, I was excited to see what Square Enix was going to do with the job, and the results are pretty surprising. While it's not on the same level as Summoner, Red Mage is still getting a sizable revamp. We may as well start with the most exciting news. Embolden now applies to all damage instead of just physical, meaning they no longer will only benefit from specific group compositions. Ninjas, healers, other casters, and even Paladin if they do the Rec Opener for some reason. You're more than just a Res Mage to them now. On top of that, mana acquisition and consumption has been altered in significant ways. Instead of performing your melee combo at 80 mana, it has been reduced to 50. With that said, casting only nets 33 to 52% less mana, meaning there's a good chance you'll actually be performing fewer melee combos. Outside of this, you'll have your new finisher, appropriately called Resolution, that does line AoE damage. To compensate for the additional spell, Manification lasts 15 seconds and will actually increase your mana by 50 instead of doubling it. There's 2 stacks of Acceleration, Corpse, and Engagement, which is now the same potency as Displacement, and you get level 40. So you can basically throw the ladder out the window at this point. I'm enjoying what they're doing with Red Mage, even giving it a 10% party-wide shield, making it an even greater support class with the damage to boot. For melee, I suppose we should start with what everyone is talking about, Reaper. The edgy job seemingly everyone wants to play. It's not as complicated as we originally thought. Reaper's rotation is relatively simple. Your 1, 2, 3 will generate Soul, the red gauge, and after 50 is gained, you'll be able to use a Fell Cleave-esque attack, which is followed up with another denoted in blue to gain Shroud. You do this until you earn 50 Shroud, and at that point you're able to unleash your avatar and deal immense damage. At this point, the 2 attacks reverse responsibility, as the Shroud attacks are followed up with a Soul attack, and then when you have 1 gauge left on your new bar, you use a Madari-esque finisher. You just repeat this with a couple of other abilities and OGCDs helping along the way. For example, there's a Soul attack you can use once a minute that lets you follow up with 2 Shroud attacks. There's also a damage buff, a personal shield, and its own unique disengage and gap closer, which is really nice considering you don't need a target to perform. There's also a dedicated damage buff that you apply to an enemy, which I am not a fan of. It overcomplicates a buff that's part of many rotations, such as Samurai, Warrior, and Dragoon, which you have to apply to each enemy individually. I originally thought it might be a trick attack style blow, but no, it's a buff that only applies to you. Granted, it ensures you aren't splintering your rotation like Warrior Storm's Eye, but it just doesn't feel like it was worked in smoothly. At the end of the session, Reaper was fun, but probably not something for me. Even if I enjoy melee jobs like Samurai and Dragoon, I personally am not a fan of the multitude of different gauges that Reaper has. Maybe I just need more time with the job, but at the end of the day, Reaper comes with a number of elements that both intrigue and disappoint me. One of the first melee jobs, Monk has gone through a lot over the last year. In 2020, we saw the job reworked in a meaningful way, and now in 2021 we see yet another revamp. The core rotation remains the same with identical buffs and dots, but what has changed is perfect balance. Instead of giving you 6 stacks which can be used on any strike, it now only gives you 3, and this ties into the new Masterful Blitz system. Here OGCDs such as Elixir Field and Tornado Kick have been placed in a system where, depending on the attacks you perform, you will be granted different seals. Depending on the seal combination, you'll be able to perform 1 of 4 attacks at the end of perfect balance. This is going to massively change how we approach Monk outside of the standard rotation. Outside of this, positionals for Raptor form attacks such as True Strike and Twin Snakes have been completely removed, which I think is a fantastic adjustment. Having to consistently worry about your positionals every attack is stressful, but this is relieved when 1/3 of them are removed, giving you some time to actually process your movement. Riddle of Wind also makes its return from Stormblood, but does something drastically different by increasing your auto attack speed, and there's an upgraded version of Arm of the Destroyer. Finally, there's the brand new Gap Closer that simply instant transmissions you to an enemy or ally. I absolutely love this, especially considering it doesn't do damage like Shoulder Bash, something that I wish more jobs would implement. At the end of the day, Monk has never been my personal cup of tea, and these changes, while fascinating, don't exactly compel me to make career changes. The Masterful Blitz system is a creative way to modify OGCDs, but makes it far more work on the top of a job that is known for requiring a higher level of skill. The other melee job that debuted with Realm Reborn, Dragoon, doesn't get too much. The major quality of life adjustment is that, similar to Black Mage, Blood of the Dragon is now a persistent ability, instead of being something you have to keep up. This is fine, but it really wasn't too difficult to keep it up in the first place, outside of maybe 60 and 70 level content. Outside of that, Riding Thrusts no longer requires positionals to proc, and an AoE version has been added. Both Chaos Thrust and Full Thrust have new upgrade versions, and there are 2 stacks of Lance Charge and Spine Shatter Dive. The newest addition is a First Minds gauge, which fills with 1 focus every time you complete a single target or multi-target rotation. And at the end of this, you spend 2 focus points on a heavy hitting attack. There are some other things such as Battle Litany being reduced to 120 seconds, but that's about it. It's more about the quality of life improvements and the removal of 1 gauge in favor of a slightly easier one to manage. So it's a matter of those who like Dragoon will continue to like Dragoon. Those who dislike Dragoon, well, you'll continue to dislike Dragoon. Not a whole lot has changed. Similar to Dragoon, Ninja doesn't get a whole lot added to its arsenal, but instead components to help reduce unnecessary baggage. For starters, Assassinate has been reworked where it now becomes a dream within a dream at level 56, so you no longer have to worry about that animation lock. At level 60, you also get an attack that initiates Huton without ninjutsu, which is now 60 seconds long instead of 70, which, to be honest, I think should have been added earlier considering we already have Armor Crush at this point. I don't think this would be something you use in an opener, but instead after a lengthy transition where it falls off, or during an emergency when you don't have any ninjutsu available. Outside of that, Bunshin's Shadow has a powerful new attack, Shadow Fang has been removed, and there's a follow-up to Raiton. How many times have you found yourself having to disengage and use Raiton? Well, now you have a proper gap closer and yet another strike to finish the job. This is something that fits in Ninja's arsenal perfectly. That's roughly it though. These are some quality of life improvements that'll make Ninja even more versatile. Introduced in Stormblood, Samurai has gone from a solid inclusion to one of the strongest DPS in the game, at least from a pure damage perspective. As someone who mained it all through Shadowbringer's Savage content, I was excited to see what they were doing with the job, and after seeing everything, I'm not quite sure I'm on board. For starters, Third Eye no longer procs an attack or a heal, but instead simply grants you 10 Kenki. The biggest change though is Ikitoshin is now a 120-second cooldown instead of 60, this tying into the new level 90 attack. This is Oki Namikiri, a massive strike that is only triggered whenever Ikitoshin is used, and comes with a follow-up that deals even more damage. That's right, we now have essentially 4 Midaris and a second cast bar on the melee job. Outside of this, the new attacks are AoE focused, such as the new Shoha and the long-awaited third follow-up to Fuga that grants players the Setsusen. Finally, Tsubame and Mikio both have 2 stacks, which should allow for some interesting opener optimizations. The biggest change is definitely Ikitoshin now being 120 seconds, which kind of works for level 90, but would be considered a nerf for older content. We do get 2 more Midari-esque attacks, but I'm still not entirely sold on what they're doing with Samurai. But then again, it's not like the job needed much change to begin with. The physical range that needed the most adjustments, Bard has gotten some solid improvements. Each of Bard's songs will now last 45 seconds. While this is a 50% longer boost, the cooldown is also bumped up to 120 seconds, so it more or less works out to be the same. The emphasis is keeping the songs up longer while maintaining the 1 to 2 minute buff windows. This now ties into the new Radiant Finish skill at level 90. Here, each song triggers a coda, and depending how many you collect, you'll be able to initiate a party-wide damage buff up to 5%. This is a fantastic new addition that allows Bard to rival that of its Dancer counterpart. There's also a powerful new line attack called Blast Arrow, in which Bard is able to trigger if Apex Arrow is used with the soul voice gauge being over 80. In addition, Bard's dots have been increased from 30 seconds to 45, meaning you'll be hitting Iron Jaws far fewer times. Straight Shot Ready's buff has been increased from 10 seconds to 30 seconds for actions such as Heavy Shot and Barrage, but the latter has received a significant nerf, now only being available every 2 minutes. There's a new strong attack, your songs last longer, and now you have an additional buff at the end of all 3 songs, which should line up better with your party buffs. At the end of the day, Bard feels far more accessible and a little more fun to play. Just when you thought Dark Knight, White Mage, and Scholar had the fewest changes, Machinist decided to drop in. Tactician has been reduced to 90 seconds at level 88, and Reassemble has 2 charges. As for new attacks, Scattergun turns Spread Shot into a Shotgun Blast, and there's a new Chainsaw action at level 90, which should have been a buffed Air Anchor as it functions exactly the same. And lastly, your Automaton has a new finisher. And that's it. I can't emphasize how little has actually changed with this job, as it plays exactly the same with some minor additions. Now let's talk about our final job. Introduced in Shadowbringers, there are some surprising improvements to Dancer's overall flow. The biggest change is how dances are procced and how Flourish works. Currently, you can only perform dance steps with your single targeted attacks. With Endwalker, corresponding single target and multi-target blows now share the same proc, meaning you can dance with your AoE abilities. I am not a huge fan of this change in particular, only because this lights up more than one skill, and really threw me off to the point where I had to hide my AoE abilities on another crossbar. But because of this, when you hit Flourish, you'll have to choose between the two. No longer will you be able to use every single proc. To compensate, Dancer has received 2 additional moves that generally can be used within the tech step window. Fan Dance 4 can be executed while under Flourish, while Starfall Dance comes up whenever Devilment is active. The latter is a phenomenal addition that makes Devilment more than just a button to press and pray to RNG Jesus, especially considering it guarantees a critical direct hit. There's also a follow-up to Tech Step that essentially refreshes Standard Step along with doing more damage. It's flashy, but I wish it did something a little more unique. Outside of this, Shield Samba has been reduced to a 90-second cooldown at level 88, and Improvisation gets a little bit of a rework. Along with building a spree, it will now add a heal over time effect instead of just a heal boost. On top of that, it will rack up stacks, which will give everyone inside the AoE a shield upwards of 10% of their health. Outside of the AoE attacks now being able to perform dance steps, I think a lot of the changes are strong and evolutionary for Dancer. It's a little more involved in Endwalker, but still feels as comfy as it ever has. To summarize, I am really enjoying what Square Enix is doing with most of the jobs. I'm most concerned about Dark Knight, Warrior, and Samurai, while very impressed with Paladin, Red Mage, and Dancer. Summoner's dramatic change has us hopeful, even though it's just as busy as we remember it, just with fewer buttons, and I'm still on the fence about Astrologian and Monk. I'm excited to get more time in with Sage, which isn't something I thought I would be saying, but I'm still a little hesitant on Reaper. Regardless, our time at the media event shined a bright light on the new environments. Thavnair and Garlemald both share dramatically different tones, while the dungeon left us wanting a little more from its spectacle. Still, Endwalker is shaping up to be the epic inclusion that we had hoped for when it releases on November 23rd. As always, if you like this preview, be sure to hit the like and subscribe button. Otherwise, for everything Final Fantasy XIV and gaming related, head on over to hardcoregamer.com for your fix.